Hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on from where you're connecting with us. A very warm welcome from ManageEngine to this webinar, where we will be discussing how to unify your defenses, particularly how to bridge your privileged access management and endpoint security verticals of your cybersecurity strategy, and how these different pillars of your enterprise's cybersecurity strategy need to work together. And we will see how and why they go hand in hand, and why it is important to take a holistic approach to your cybersecurity strategy even beyond these controls, right? But before we begin, a couple of housekeeping rules. All attendees will be on listen-only mode by default. If you have any questions during the webinar, please leave them in the Q&A panel. We have a panel of experts available who will be answering your questions on chat. We'll also be answering any questions that weren't addressed at the end of the session. The session will be recorded, and we'll be sending you the recording in a couple of days. Before we get into the nitty-gritties of how and why endpoint security and privileged access management need to go hand in hand, let us first discuss the evolving threat landscape across the world, right? So it is no longer just enough to manage your identities, right? It is no longer just enough to put your passwords in a secure vault or ensure you install a solution such as Endpoint Central on your endpoints and be done with it, right? Privileges as well as threats to your environment arise from everywhere, especially in the last 5 years where the entire world has transitioned to working more remotely, right? Most of your organizations would probably have third-party workers or contract workers or your own employees across the world. So in such a distributed manner, when your identities are not just stored in your local servers but on cloud, you have identities as a crucial part of your developer environments and so on and so forth. Your strategy needs to have all of your pillars, whether it is CM, whether it is PAM, whether it is endpoint security, all of them need to tie in together in such a way that you have a holistic view across all of your identities, all of the possible threats to your security network, right? So how do we do that? And what happens if that is not done? Let's take a look at an example before we proceed further, right? I'm sure all of you are aware, or at least most of you are aware of this ransomware attack recently at a renowned Japanese video game organization, where through unpatched VPN gateway, attackers were able to gain access to sensitive data worth over 1 TB, right? And they were able to elevate themselves in the enterprise's network uh, and perform privilege escalation attacks, which then led to the company facing downtime, um, also the demand of a ransom, as well as they had to reallocate their resources to mitigate this issue, right? So this is one particular example where what we see here is, one, an unpatched VPN gateway, and two, it is unsecure access. It is not secure access provision through an access management tool, right? It's just a VPN gateway. And perhaps what privileges the attackers gained access to, what credentials, had the ability to be able to go through the entire network because they did not have any fine-grained access control mechanisms, right? Um, I'm Fazil, an enterprise analyst from ManageEngine. I'm joined by Abita, who will now walk you through the specifics of this issue and how this strategy could be mitigated with ManageEngine.
Thank you, Fazil. Hello, everyone. I'm Abita, a product expert from ManageEngine. Fazil took us through the cyber attack that happened to a globally known and established organization. This goes to show that cyber attacks are not a matter of if, but rather a when. With that said, let's dissect this incident further to understand what exactly went down at each stage of the event. Let's start with the attack vector, that is, the entry point that the threat actor exploited to break into the organization's network. It was simply an unpatched vulnerability in a VPN gateway, which they had retained as a backup. Ironically, this gateway was exploited in the midst of the organization attempting to enhance the security of their IT infrastructure. Once the threat actor entered the network, their lateral movement resulted in elevating their privileges to gain access to the organization's servers in the US and Japan. With escalated privileges at hand, They chose to exfiltrate corporate and personal data, including names, contact numbers, passport details, photos, addresses, and other PII data. This alone counts as a major breach of compliance, which typically comes with a hefty price tag and reputational damage. But this was just the third stage of the attack. Next up, the threat actors injected Ragnar Locker ransomware into the organization's network, encrypted around 2,000 devices, and demanded $11 million in Bitcoin for the decryptor. Following consultations with law enforcement, the organization decided not to pay the ransom. And within a matter of weeks, the data was publicly available on third party sites. Now that we understand how this attack was orchestrated, let's delve deeper into the incident. What was the weak link at each stage of the attack, and how ManageEngine can stop threat actors in each of these stages. Stage 1, the doorway to disaster. The exploit was a known vulnerability in a specific VPN router with CVE 2018-13379 with a severity index of critical. Let's assume they had a security solution in place. This solution could have scanned for vulnerabilities in the network, identified this particular vulnerability, and helped mitigate the risk through a simple patch. With ManageEngine, you can get a complete picture of your threat landscape, prioritize critical vulnerabilities, and automate the entire patch deployment process, from testing and approval to deployment. Stage 2, a single point of failure. In the second stage of the attack, the threat actors were successfully able to have their privileges escalated to gain access to sensitive systems with ease. Additionally, without zero trust controls in place, any single point of entry meant that multiple systems could potentially be compromised. On top of this, the lack of real time monitoring of privileged sessions meant that attackers could operate undetected. ManageEngine empowers you to keep the keys to your kingdom safe through comprehensive privilege access management. You can grant just in time access to admins, users, apps, and scripts, and allow them to access business critical information only when required. This will allow you to eliminate the need for granting elevated privileges permanently. PAM360 can also generate dynamic trust scores for devices and users based on key parameters and risk factors that you can customize. Based on these trust scores, you can trigger custom automated actions like terminating sessions and revoking access when these scores fall below a set threshold. You can also monitor, record, and archive privileged sessions to detect and terminate any suspicious session, and you can also use these recordings and logs for audits and incident forensics. Stage 3, bytes and business compromised. What was the weak link at this stage? Encryption is considered to be a non negotiable when it comes to data security. But this crucial measure was absent. On top of this, the organization did not have a system to identify sensitive data, monitor and restrict its transfer, and keep admins notified of suspicious data movement. With ManageEngine, every system that enters the network can be automatically encrypted along with complete recovery key lifecycle management to eliminate the hassles of storing, maintaining, and rotating recovery keys. You can also implement an effective data loss prevention strategy, starting with defining what is sensitive to your organization, detecting and monitoring sensitive data movement, restricting and preventing unauthorized data transfer attempts across channels like email, cloud, peripheral devices, browsers, printers, clipboards, and more. 4. In this stage, we meet the unnoticed invader, that is the ransomware. At this stage, there are two glaring security gaps in the organization. One, the absence of user behavior analysis, and two, the lack of ransomware protection. Here's how ManageEngine can help. We have a multi-patented anti-ransomware protection module, which detects anomalous behavior in real time. 5. A company held hostage. As the organization didn't have a proper data backup and recovery protocol in place, they were forced to either pay the ransom or face the consequences. In this case, it was having their data leaked. With ManageEngine, they could have identified the malware in its initial stages and quarantined the infected systems to prevent the spread further. Even if their entire network had been infected, the data could have been recovered without paying a ransom. Up next, Fazil will walk you through the importance of privilege segmentation and governance to take your enterprise's security to the next level.
Thank you, Abita. So everything that Abita ran all of you through, you can notice that with the widening threat network that we saw, with the threat landscape expanding more than ever, we saw how identities are present everywhere, right? So if you notice the five stages in which five steps that Abita had mentioned, you notice that it is no longer just necessary to gate access controls or uh, gate credential management alone, right? Where even if you have secure credential management and you store all of your credentials in a secure repository and you share those credentials with your users, what you're not taking into account the human element that exists, right? It's not just enough to securely store your credentials and share those credentials securely to your internal employees, because as part of the human element is also the internal malicious actor, right? Privilege abuse attacks are more than often attacks that happen due to an internal employee, right? So there is that angle to it. And there is also the angle of human error, right? To err is human. And there is no way that we cannot say that this will never exist in our organization. But however, what we can do is ensure checks and balances at every stage, such that it is not all or nothing access. If you store all of your credentials in a secure repository and you share access to sensitive accounts, resources, and endpoints to your users by sharing those credentials, without any access controls in place, you're sharing access to the entire sensitive mission and all the data that it contains. So how do you tackle this? What you can do is you can ensure you have checks and balances at every step of a user's privilege access journey. Now, what is a user's privilege access journey? The user first requires access to a particular endpoint, right? Or a server or a firewall and so on. The user requests access and is provisioned access by the administrator. Now, there could be a check and balance here, right? The administrator can validate if the request is valid, if it is a valid employee, and then have that approved on a case-to-case basis. Right? Apart from that, you can also, whatever endpoint the user has access to, the user might not require access to the entire endpoint. There you can have access control mechanisms such as application control or command controls and so on, right? So just like that, every step of the user's journey can have checks and balances. Privileged access management is a solution that can help you do that, right? But before we get into it, now we took it for granted that all of you have essential identity management or credential management controls in place, right? Let's take a look at what the first step is first. First step is obviously, like I mentioned, to store all of your credentials in a secure password vault or a repository, and ensure password policies are in place such that you have strong passwords to your sensitive missions, and whatever password policy that your organization requires is followed throughout your organization for all users and resources. Yeah, and then there is secure password sharing. You refrain from sharing passwords via plain text, which could obviously lead to which has a higher chance of password exposure and can result in privilege abuse attacks amongst many others. And you have a stipulated time within which you reset your passwords once they are shared with the user, right? And of course, we can't forget auditing and reporting for all password actions that take place in your organization. But like I mentioned, is this enough? Clearly not, right? You've just scratched the surface. You're just getting started with your privileged access management journey. Privileged access management or even identity management is not just about password vaulting and secure password sharing. What it is about is privileged account and session management, where you control every aspect of a privileged account that you share the passwords to, and you govern those accounts. What type of access levels? What is that user, and what type of role that the user does the user play in the organization? What is the user's requirement? You ask all of these questions, and you implement fine-grained role and policy-based access controls. There's also privileged user behavior analytics. You can, of course, take use of other tools like CM as well to coordinate data. But the ideal perspective from an organization's view is to ensure that every user has a stipulated behavior pattern, right? And any radical deviation from the behavioral pattern should at least notify the administrator, right? How do you do that? How do you evaluate that in real time, right? Because that is essential. If an employee in your organization's credential is compromised and someone is using that to perform actions that wouldn't be normally the actions performed by that employee, then your administrator needs to stay on top of that, right? You also need to have privilege elevation and delegation management controls such that you do not provide admin access or elevated access to a user straight away. You provide them with the least privilege that they required, right? You follow the principle of least privilege across your organization, I'm sure. And then you grant them elevated access for a stipulated time period based on a request, based on what their task is and for what mission they require. And then you have secrets management, right? And then you have key and certificate lifecycle management, like Abita mentioned. If you want to manage the entire lifecycle of your certificates and ensure that you stay on top of your expiration dates and ensure you have renewals take place regularly, PAM 360 or a PAM solution should help you out with that as well. Now, all of this might be better visualized if I put a couple of examples in front of you. Right? So first, let's take the case of John. It is very similar to the example that we saw previously, but let's take the route of an attacker to be a remote employee. John could be a third-party contract worker or a remote employee. The point is, all of the sensitive credentials that John requires access to is shared to John in a static repository in plain text format, right? Such as an Excel sheet, and which is one malware attack away from compromising your entire network. Because how do you share credentials when they're shared to you in plain text? Let's say John needs to share it with someone else in the team. How would John share it? John would copy it from the Excel sheet for the mission, provide the username or password to his teammate via a third-party chat app like such as Click or Slack or something, right? Which then opens up a whole variety of issues, including password exposure and so on and so forth. Right. Secondly, the Excel sheet file itself is not secure, right? That could be compromised. You are one employee away from compromising your entire network, right? So this is definitely a problem. This is something that we've seen across the board over the last 10 years, where credentials which are not stored securely and credentials stored in plain text format without access controls being the primary source of issues from a cybersecurity point of view. Now, we saw the problems in that example, right? What does John have? VPN-based access, right, which is not secure, which requires sharing of credentials in plain text format, right? John has access to the entire missions with those admin credentials. There's no access control mechanism. John has permanent standing privileges. Once the Excel sheet is shared to John, that Excel sheet is not going to be revoked. It's going to be lost in a khazana, right? So how do you ensure that these problems do not arise, going beyond just password hygiene? Possible solutions could include providing secure passwordless access to resources through a privileged access management tool, where you don't even share the password with John, let alone in plain text format. You only provision access to certain missions depending on John's requirement without actually sharing the password, right? And you, based on John's role, John wouldn't require admin access to every mission. John wouldn't require admin access to even missions that John is supposed to run on a daily basis. Right? So what is John's role? And how do you implement fine-grained access controls depending on what John's role is? Right? And then you have, once John finishes his task, you can ensure you set up automated remote password resets for all critical systems. In such a manner, even if John has access to credentials for that particular mission, access is revoked, firstly, and secondly, the password is reset. So that way there are no standing privileges. Now, an ideal scenario could happen using a privileged access management solution where you could simply create a user, have role-based access control in place, right? Ensure you have password policy in place. You do not share the password with John, you only share access, and then you revoke access or lock the user once John's task is done, right? Let's take a quick dive into how you can do this using PAM 360. I have recorded a video for you, which I'm just going to show it to you, right? So firstly, we're going to add a user. John is a third-party contract worker or a remote employee. So John is not an administrator of any kind. So you see in the role that is specified for John, it is password user. It is not one of the predefined administrator role that PAM360 provides, as you can see, right? It's only a end user. John would either require password user level of access or connection user level of access. Now you see, we generate a password for John based on your password policy. And once John's job is done, you can simply lock the user once the contract runs out, right? So this is very effective. This way, there are no standing privileges. So the ideal scenario is where you can practice complete governance over all remote users, right? You're not just going to have one third-party contract employee, or you're not going to have just one remote employee. They're going to be across the world, and they're going to be there's going to be a lot of them. So imagine if you can ensure complete governance over all of them. Then we are not sharing access via VPN in an unsecure method. We are sharing access through PAM360, which is a privileged access management tool, where we are securely sharing access without exposing passwords, and we are revoking access privileges once it's done. Right? So this completely prevents credential exposure or remote network infiltration of any kind. And we can also limit the visibility simply to necessary endpoints. Not all missions are required by John, right? You only share certain missions that are required by John and only required level of access to those endpoints. So this way we solve the first problem. Now let's take a look at another problem. Here, John is not just a remote employee. John has a regular requirement to access code repositories in order to perform health checks, right? But if you provide administrative access to John for all of these systems and you keep them there with John, that's all the threat actors require, right? All they need to gain admin access to your critical servers are to simply get access to John's user account in whatever solution you use to permeate your network, right? So how do you control this? How do you control this from being an enterprise level problem? Again, let's look at what the problem that we have here is. Standing admin privileges? Yes. John does require regular access to code repositories to perform health checks, but does John require constant administrative access 24/7 for eternity? Definitely not, right? That is the entire problem of standing privileges. And if you do that, you are not provisioning least privilege access, and you're not in line with the principle of least privilege access, which will then land you up in a lot of compliance problems. And just by exposing John's credentials, you allow threat actors to gain lateral entry into your network, and you're subject to privilege escalation attacks, right? And there is no access control in place. Now, okay, you've provisioned John with administrative access simply because John requires access to code repositories. Now, that is not how it's supposed to work. John only requires access to code repositories, does not require administrative access. So how can you ensure fine-grained controls for that, right? And even if you share those credentials with John, even if John has administrative access levels, you can ensure that you know and you are aware of what John is doing by simply recording all sessions, joining sessions whenever required to monitor and shadow, and terminating sessions when there are suspicious activity, right? But in this case, that is not done. See, what are the possible solutions? I might have already hinted at them, but ensure password request release workflows. Now, what are password request release workflows? Simple. You must be using an IT service management tool like Service Desk Plus, right? And if you aren't, you should definitely start using one. But when a ticket is raised by John to request access to a particular machine, your administrators can validate that ticket ID, right? And ensure that this is a valid ticket request for a stipulated amount of time, and then they can approve that ticket. And your administrator in PAM360 can check for the ticket ID from John when they're requesting access, ensure that this is a valid ticket that has been approved, and then accept this access request. right? So this way you have multiple checks and balances even at the first stage to ensure John actually requires access for the stipulated amount of time to this machine. Secondly, you do not grant entire access to the machine that is required by John. You provide the least amount of privileges that John requires, subject to just-in-time privilege elevation, where if John requires elevated privileges, you can raise John to a local admin account or a domain admin account in order for John to perform those functions for a limited period of time, let's say 30 minutes. And once that period is done, John's privileges are automatically revoked to non-administrative privileges. And John is removed from those admin groups and placed in non-admin groups, right? And then you can have access policies in place for real-time risk assessment. What if I told you, even if you share, even if you follow every bit of access control when you're sharing access to a particular machine, you cannot prevent what happens in real time. You cannot be wary of John's actions, which ties us back to the human element, right? More than three-fourths of attacks happen as a result of the human element. Now, how do you counter this? You set up real-time zero trust scores in place so such that you can evaluate the trust of every user at any point in time. You can set up factors that are important for your organization, set up what level of scoring you would give to them, and say a user score drops below a certain threshold or an endpoint score drops below a certain threshold, you can automatically terminate access for that user to that endpoint, right? So, and you can also not just do that, you can also set up policies, right? If you want to restrict access, even if the scoring drops by 5, right? You can do that as well. So you can have fine-grained access control mechanisms that way. What if, in remote session monitoring, you want to detect and terminate suspicious activity in real time? You can do that. Like I said, you can join the session, shadow it, and if there's any deviation in the user's activity, you can immediately terminate the session. And for forensic purposes, you can audit the sessions and record them such that if anything goes wrong, you can always go back to the session and see what went wrong, which makes your forensic process that much more easier. Now, I'll again show you how this can be done using a PAM solution with ManageEngine's PAM360. What sort of access controls can you put in place, right? We are in the administrative panel of PAM360, where for this specific user account, I want to configure access controls in this endpoint. Yeah, I can set up with which administrators they require approval from and enforce access levels for example, let's say you require at least 2 administrators approval just to have a fail safe. Even if you have access control mechanisms in place, you can do that as well, right? And you can enforce users to provide a reason, you can enforce them to provide a ticket ID and so on. And you can set up the time period of access in such a way. And you see the last check checkbox here. You can reset the password after exclusive use. Once they're done using, you can automatically reset the password of that user account in the endpoint. Now you can select for privilege elevation purposes if the user requires elevated access to which local group or domain groups you want to elevate them to. Here, we're going to select a group which is remote desktop users, right? And we're going to save. Now, this is from the administrative panel. You set up certain actions. Now let's look at this from a user's point of view. How does it look? You can just see it's a user with non-administrative privileges, and the user can't open a connection. The user has to request for a password. Now, the user has to provide a reason. Of course, you can also enforce ticket ID to be provided here. And now the user must wait for the administrator's approval. In case you've configured 2 administrators' approval, both the administrators need to approve before the access is granted to the user. Now the administrator can state the reason and just approve, right? All the user needs to do is check out the password, finish their task, and then check in. As you can see, if I'm the user, I'm checking out the password, my time period starts now. I'm launching an RDP session. Let's assume my task is done. Let's also see if the user has been elevated to the local group since we configured privilege elevation, right? Yes. So remote desktop users, the user has been elevated. Now I'm going to check in the password once my task is complete, right? Now, if the user requires access to the machine again, the user needs to place another access request. Just because it was approved once doesn't mean it's going to be approved the second time. Now, as you can see in the groups, the user is not there in the remote desktop user. So the user has been automatically removed from the local admin group. So, and this is also recorded in the audit. And you can see this, you can look at the sessions recording and so on, right? So this is one method. We talked about real-time trust scoring, right? Let's have a look at that as well. So what can you do with PAM360? Firstly, let's take a look at this endpoint. I've installed my Zero Trust agent and Zero Trust is enabled for this endpoint. Now let's take a look at what we can do at a user level and at a endpoint level. Now these are user factors. How many invalid sign-in attempts? Is someone trying a password brute force attack, right? Non-office hours sign-in is someone from another region, using the employees' passwords to log into your system, and so on and so forth. You can configure factors in such a way, whatever is important to your organization, you can assign value to them and you can have them in place. At an endpoint level, you can set up so many other factors which are important to your organization and provision scoring depending on what is required for you. Right? So once this is done, you can set up policies, access policies for that endpoint, and the administrator must first approve it, right? And then you can assign these access policies to the specific endpoint, such that if the user's trust score drops below a certain threshold, for example, here you can see that if the user's trust score drops below 50 or the resource's trust score drops below 80, then this access will be terminated immediately. That's the policy that we've set up, right? So this is something that you can do such that you can monitor the user's behavior as well as the health of the endpoint in real time using PAM360. See, I have multiple policies set up here, right? And it applies to all users. So this is also something that you can do with PAM360. Going back to the slide, let's see if we've met the ideal scenario. Have we set up least privilege access? Yes, we have. Have we set up temporary requisite access privileges to critical systems? Yes, we have. Have we set up access policies at a granular level for each endpoint and user account such that it is evaluated in real time? Yes. Have we prevented lateral entry into the network? Yes, because the user gets access only to that machine for that time period, right? They can't move around the network. And is all the activity audited and recorded? Yes, we've achieved that as well. So this is from an access management perspective, right? But PAM360 does not just do that. There's so much more that you can do with PAM360. For example, you can manage the entire lifecycle of your TLS certificates. You can manage mission identities, developer secrets. You can manage service and application accounts, and so on, right? Also, compliance regulations, I'm sure, is important to all of your organizations, right? With PAM360, you can comply. PAM360 can help you comply with PCI DSS, ISO, GDPR, LGPD, SEBI, and NERC, and so much more, right? So also let's look at the cyber insurance perspective in today's world. Privileged access management is a vital component of cyber insurance requirements, where organizations that provide cyber insurance and cyber insurance policies mandate the required level of access controls that are required from every organization, right? And premium rates depend on them significantly. And if you use a privileged access management solution, there's a huge difference between the premium rates that you pay with a PAM solution and without. And PAM 360 can definitely help you in that angle as well. And you can also ensure that you can maintain zero standing privileges. That's a big term to use, zero standing privileges. If you ask me, can that be achieved? I've seen a lot of enterprises across the world achieve zero standing privileges simply by ensuring that they do not provide standing privileges in the first place. If you use a PAM solution like PAM360, you do not have to provision permanent access. You do not have to share passwords in plain text. You do not have to provision admin access to everyone, to every endpoint. And you can maintain all sorts of real-time access management and access policy measurements, right? As we saw with the trust scoring. So you can do all of this. Quick recap of everything we saw with PAM360. TLS certificates, entire life cycles can be managed. Privilege account and session management, we saw that. Elevation and delegation management, we saw that. You can evaluate users' behavior in real time. You can also tie this in with your CM tool for additional accuracy. PAM360 also has cloud infrastructure entitlements management, commonly known as CIM. So if you have cloud entities in AWS and you want to make sure that there are no excess permissions or privileges there, you can do that with PAM360. Workload identity management. And if you want to automate your business workflows and ensure your repetitive tasks are automated, PAM360 can help you with that as well. Comprehensive auditing and compliance reporting, and fine-grained application and command control. You remember, you don't just have to provision access to an entire mission, you can provision access to specific applications and commands. And PAM360 also supports the governance for non-human identities. This is just from an access management perspective, but you can do so much more at fine-grained access controls from an endpoint perspective. Back to Abhita to take you through the next set of the session.
Thank you, Fazil. That was really insightful. And I'm sure everyone now knows the importance of segmenting and regulating privileges across their enterprise networks and how exactly PAM 360 helps them do this. Let's briefly go back to the incident that we saw earlier. In that ransomware incident, the attack vector was an unpatched vulnerability. While this is one commonly exploited attack vector, there are a few other entry points that attackers tend to exploit as well. These include peripheral devices, browsers, and applications. Peripheral devices such as USBs, keyboards, mouse, printers, and Bluetooth devices are widely used in organizations for carrying out various operations. While these are commonplace, the threat that they potentially carry is significant. In fact, around 52% of malware attacks stem from USB devices. To counter these threats, Endpoint Central offers a dedicated device control module that enables you to block unauthorized peripheral devices from your enterprise perimeter, allow the usage of trusted devices, and if needed, provide temporary access as well. We also offer file shadowing capabilities that allows you to monitor the data movement via peripherals, create backups of the transferred files, and maintain audit trails. When it comes to applications, it is important to keep untrusted applications at bay. Endpoint Central's application control module helps you create allow lists of trusted and productivity enhancing applications and block list untrusted and productivity hindering applications to allow you to take care of application security without hindering user productivity. We also consider browsers as a separate endpoint that demands dedicated security protocols to stay ahead of browser based threats. Be it phishing, malicious downloads, unauthorized extensions, sensitive data uploads to the cloud, or compliance breaches, the browser security module helps you create a safe enterprise browsing experience without the need for an actual enterprise browser. You can keep track of users' web activity, enforce web filters, restrict unauthorized browsers, and isolate browsers if needed. Let's take a quick look at the Endpoint Central console and see what you can do to manage or secure from each of these exploitable avenues. So first, device control, which will control the use of peripherals in your organization. So I'll create an example policy and show you what exactly we can manage in terms of the peripherals used. Or you'll have a list of all the peripherals that you can either allow or block from being used in your organization. And we also have another option called allow trusted devices. So when I select this for a removable storage device, I have the option to select a list of trusted devices that can be allowed to be used in my organization. So let's say that you are an organization that uses a set of peripherals or a known set of storage devices that is commonly used to transfer files among employees or presentations and software and videos and those kinds of things. So you can add these peripherals under the trusted devices module and you can select them here. You can also restrict data being shared from other removable storage devices and to those devices. And you can configure your file shadow settings here. So what this will do is it will create a copy of the files in the peripheral devices in the path that you specify here. And this can be used for audit purposes. And we have another thing called temporary access here. So let's say that in your organization, you don't really have a set of trusted peripherals, but instead there are certain requirements or certain times when a specific peripheral needs to be allowed access. In that case, you can configure temporary access for that peripheral for the specific period of time. And next we have app control. In the app control module, we saw that you can set block lists and allow lists for your applications. So you can go to the applications group tab. And if we click on create allow list, we'll have all the applications available to us on the network. So if you want a specific set of applications to be available and accessible on the endpoint, you can select those and create an allow list. So what this means is the users will be able to access only your set of applications on the endpoint. Or if you want to allow them to access all applications except a specific few, you can instead create a block list. And up next is browsers. So for browsers, you can create various policies to secure the add-ons used in the browsers, and you can even create download and uh, web filters. So when you create a download filter or a web filter, you can block downloads from specific domains, or you can block people from even accessing those domains that you consider to be productivity hindering or malicious. And we also have threat prevention and data leak prevention capabilities here. So let's quickly take a look at the data leak prevention policy. So here you can see all of the different data leak prevention methods that you can have restricted or allowed on your enterprise browsers. You can even configure browser router, which means the specific domains will be routed to specific browsers. You can lock down your browsers to a specific set of websites or a single website, and only that will be accessible on the browser. And you can also configure web isolation, which will create a virtual browser which will route any traffic that users that you decide is not suitable for corporate use. So let's say that the users also use the same browsers for personal use. In that case, you can isolate those domains or you can isolate those websites in a separate virtual browser so that it doesn't come in contact with your corporate browsing. Let's go back to the presentation. Continuation of the privilege management that Fazil took us through, we'll now take a look at how privilege management and endpoint security complement each other to achieve a holistic IT security strategy. Starting with endpoint privilege management. Around 80% of cyber attacks involve privilege compromise. And granting excessive privileges catalyzes the lateral movement of an attack. What this means is, with escalated privileges, bad actors will have that much more easier of a time moving across your network looking for avenues to exploit. So it is important to take the utmost care to prevent the accumulation of privileges. The way forward is to enforce the principle of least privilege and to elevate it privileges on demand. You can go for password-based and passwordless elevation. So Fazil had took us through the password-based elevation strategies that can be carried out with ManageEngine PAM360. We'll now see what you can do with Endpoint Central. Endpoint Central, you can monitor privileges and enforce control over all privileged accounts to reduce the risk of unauthorized access. You can remove unnecessary local admin rights and configure policies that allow users to self-elevate privileges for specific applications. Instead of providing permanent access, you can opt for just-in-time access, which will automatically be revoked after a defined period. In addition to managing applications, you can also control the child processes of those applications. So let's go to the endpoint privilege management module in the console. So we'll go back to the application control module. Here we'll have a policy to manage the endpoint privileges. So we recommend a combination of both of these tabs. So the remove admin rights tab will help you to remove local admin accounts from the devices that are managed. So you can simply select the devices that are managed and click on remove local admin accounts, and this will remove the local admin privileges from those endpoints. Now coming back to privilege management, here you can set which privileges to be elevated and for which applications and processes. So I have a complete list of applications or vendors, the executables that can self-elevate their privileges, and I even allow my users to elevate applications manually. So how this helps me is it'll help me save time on addressing requests from users about privilege elevation and ensure that it is limited to only a trusted set of applications, products, and executables. So this is how you can manage endpoint privileges. Um, Going back, we saw earlier that with PAM360, you can obtain the trust score for each device and user based on specific behavioral patterns. You can identify high-risk systems and isolate them from the network using the system quarantine capability in Endpoint Central as well. We'll see this a bit more in depth soon, but let's take a look at the bigger picture for a moment. How can you make sure that you're granting the right access at the right time and place to the right users outside the scope of privilege management? Here's how. Be it any type of endpoint, we have a way to ensure that you're granting your users the right level of access while maintaining enterprise security simultaneously. First up, we have conditional access. Ensuring that your workforce is accessing business essential documents and sensitive files through devices that are compliant with your organization's security policies is a very important part of eliminating threats that arise from vulnerable devices. Conditional access, you can make sure that your workforce is allowed to access corporate apps, resources, and mailboxes only from trusted and compliant devices. It's simple. If a mobile device is under the management of Endpoint Central, it can access corporate data. And if it's managed, it automatically means that the device management policy is applied by the admin on the device. This in turn means that any device accessing the Exchange server or Office 365 apps is compliant with your security policies and is trusted. On top of this, you'll also get a complete report of compliant devices accessing the Exchange server and the devices that are blocked from accessing the server. So let's go to the console. And under the mobile device management module, we have something called conditional access. So here you'll be able to configure your conditional access policy for either your Exchange server or Office 365 apps. And once you configure it, you will have a list of devices accessing the Exchange server or the Office 365 apps that have not been enrolled yet. So all of these devices are not enrolled yet and are marked as non-compliant. Now I can configure a grace period during which they'll be allowed to access the apps or the server. After the grace period, they'll be forced to enroll their devices to continue accessing the server. To keep your endpoints across your network secure from bad actors, you can configure network access control and have endpoints that aren't compliant with your organization's security policies isolated from the rest of the network. Endpoint Central allows you to set up checks based on suspicious software, missing patches, and more to identify non-compliant devices. So when a system is found to be non-compliant, that is when it fails any of these checks that you have set in place, you can block network access for that system. And if needed, you can even set specific domains and IP addresses that the machine can access even during quarantine. So on the console, we'll take a look at how this is done. So this is under the threats and patches tab under compliance. And here we have the system quarantine policy. So let me create a policy and see what is configurable. So I have the set of checks that need to be performed on my endpoints, and this includes the patches, services running on the endpoint, software installed on it, any vulnerabilities present, the files and registries on that endpoint. And once I select my checks, I can choose to perform it just for audit purposes, that is, keep me notified when a device is out of compliance, or I can choose to quarantine the endpoint. So here we have the option to block all network access or allow or block access to specific IPs and domains or block only the internet in a specific range. Similar to conditional access, we can set a grace period for customers, device users, where they'll be shown a message or an alert saying that their endpoint is out of compliance. And after the grace period, the device will automatically be moved into quarantine. So we have seen how you can do network access control and system quarantine with Endpoint Central. When it comes to granting time-based access, Fazal had walked us through just-in-time access. In the case of mobile endpoints, you can also grant time-based access using the autonomous single app mode. So what this does is you can configure devices to automatically launch a specific app during a specific window of time. This can be accomplished using Endpoint Central's kiosk mode capabilities that allow you to restrict normal devices to run a single app or only an approved set of apps. So back to the console. This time we'll create a device management policy to configure these settings. Let me create an iOS profile. And here we'll have an option for a kiosk profile. So I have the option to make it a single app mode or multi-app mode or add autonomous apps. In single app mode, I can pin a singular app to the device out of which the user will not be able to exit out of. Let's select multi-app mode for now. And I can select apps that will suit my organization or my users. So let's say I select an accounting app, a billing management app, and an event management app. So my users need to conduct a specific event during a specific period of time. So once I select the app that is related to the event management, I can go ahead and set this as a autonomous app. Now, in the backend, you'll need to configure this app to be automatically launched during a specific period of time. And for the device user, they can access this app during that time. As an extension of this is Endpoint Central's shared device mode. But before that, let's see what else you can configure under kiosk mode. You have the option to edit the device's screen layout. So you'll have a complete preview of the device screen. You can move around apps or even pin them to the dock for easier access. Now back to shared device mode, you can create dedicated workspaces for each user that accesses the device and authenticate users with the directory service or through the managed Apple ID. So you can dictate exactly which apps and files appear on the device when that user logs in and set how long they can stay logged in for and clear the workspace of data once the session is over. And that's how through shared and kiosk device modes, you can implement both time-based as well as user-based access to create a secure work environment, even on mobile devices. Another important aspect of certain compliance regulations is that data should remain within specific boundaries. When you're dealing with desktops or stationary workstations, this doesn't really pose a threat. But when you're dealing with mobile devices, these devices are often remote to the office or roaming in different locations. This necessitates the need for location-based access. Endpoint Central helps you to do this through geofencing. You can create geographical boundaries and dictate what happens to a device when it leaves that boundary. You can also stay notified when devices become non-compliant with the set policy and have that particular device's access to corporate data revoked. So back to the console we go. And this time under the management tab, we'll have our fence repository and fence policy options. So let me show you an example of a geofence. So here you can pin a location to the office. Let's say that you want the data to remain within your office premises and also mention a radius for this. So this will create a geographical boundary and you can click on create to add it to your fence repository. One thing of note here is that we use our own native Maps app by leveraging Zoho Maps. So we will not be sharing your data to any third parties. And in the fence policy, you can create a policy and you can choose when devices are marked as non-compliant. So in this case, we want our data to remain within the office premises. So devices will be marked as non-compliant when they're no longer within the premises. We can select the fence that we had just created. And we can have certain actions to be triggered either immediately or after a day when the device steps out of the boundary. So immediately you can have the admin notified. And you can also configure this template and even notify your users about the device being not compliant. In addition to this, you can also put the device in lost mode, which will effectively lock the device user out of the device, and they'll no longer be able to access any data on the device. And after a day, you can have the device data completely wiped. So this will prevent any breach of compliance and help us ensure that sensitive data remains within the specific boundaries. And there's a lot more that you can do with Endpoint Central. Endpoint Central Security Edition offers a comprehensive suite of enterprise security capabilities designed to protect your enterprise from current and emerging threats. You can gain a 360-degree visibility into your network's threat landscape, identify both known and unknown vulnerabilities, and automate the patch deployment process for seamless patch deployment. We've covered a little bit of all of these modules in today's session. If you want to explore any of these in depth, we are always open to have a free and personalized demo session at a time of your convenience. Just drop in your mail in the chat section. Now, there is one other capability, which is ransomware protection. And I have a video to demo this capability for you. So in this video, we are launching the Conti ransomware into an endpoint through the command line. And once this is done, and once the details are registered in the task manager, Endpoint Central's ransomware anti-ransomware module throws up an alert saying that a ransomware has been detected, including the executed path. And in the background, we can see that the files have been encrypted and are no longer accessible. We can even see that these threat actors have left a ransom note. Now, what do we do? So in the Endpoint Central's anti-ransomware module, the ransomware detected or the incident detected is noted here. We can view details about it, and we can even navigate to VirusTotal and see what other security vendors say about it. We can check the community score of this particular incident or this particular ransomware, and this will help us to determine if this is a false positive or a true positive. We can dig deeper into the details as to how it was detected and how it was executed as well. And once we do this, we can confirm that this is indeed a true positive, and we can mark it as a true positive. And when you do that, Endpoint Central will prompt you to restore your files that have been encrypted by the ransomware. And when you click on that, you can see in the background that the files that were previously encrypted will now be decrypted, and you can access these files again.